Okay, so there's a video that is going around on Facebook and on YouTube. It's from ACT TV called Systemic Racism Explained.
I'm going to try to dismiss the subject.
The real revolution begins at
Stanford University. I have a postbox there, postbox S, which is the same as Shackley and Stanford. I will try to supply more information, and I'm sure Dr. Welsing will say what she can do about telling people how to reach her pamphlet. Okay. But my principal point, Mr. Brown, is not so much a theory of black-white differences, but is summed up in one word, which is the theme of my appearance on your program and my efforts, and the word is dysgenics. And dysgenics means effectively downbreeding, retrogressive evolution. And I fear that this is worst for the black community, and I particularly welcome an opportunity to appear on Black Journal just for these reasons. And let me say also,
our skin is an organ. It does not think, it does not formulate ideas, it is merely the genetic result of our parents.
How do you respond to that?
if I really had those, I don't think I would be here this evening.
Our ability to use our brain and reason in a free society, such as in America, is why we have overturned the blight and the negative aftermath of racism that began with colonial slavery.
I feel that what I'm engaged in is a demand for diagnosis, and I'd like to say some more about this chart, which we'll come to probably later, which shows the disproportionate rates of reproduction for the least effective elements of the black community. I'd like to say more about that than we should in just this brief introduction.
In all fairness, you should explain to the audience why it is that you have, first of all, you have a very large segment of the black population who are on farms, who are deprived in cities. Why don't you explain at the time that you're showing this, who is keeping black people in a situation like they're in? I mean, it could be, you could turn it around the other way, where you could have very large numbers of black people who are exposed to educational opportunities like white people, who are exposed to housing, who are exposed to health facilities. Why don't you explain that at the same time that you put figures like that?
I'm sure you would explain it,
no, but
Dr.
I think
Welsing,
it's important
but
in
one must say first things first. And you've raised the basic question there, and that is whether the disadvantages are primarily a lack of opportunity or whether they are primarily a basic genetic difference.
You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism.
Now we reach the crux of the matter. The basic idea
I think there is another word that better describes what I'm involved in, and that word is race-ology, which means a scientific analysis of racial differences. And I have a faith that reason is a good thing, and I feel as you do about the First Amendment, but maybe with a slightly different emphasis. I think the really important thing about the First Amendment is it is a way of guaranteeing a high likelihood that truth will emerge as a result of conflicting ideas being expressed, and I have a thesis and a basic belief that truth is a good thing and will be of benefit to man.
You white folks have either one of two choices. Give me my damn freedom or kill me.
I'm going to say that if there were not a basic difference in intellectual capacity in the past, there probably will be a basic difference between black and white intellectual capacity in the future, simply because of the reproduction patterns. And these are Census Bureau data, and this is the most threatening aspect. And what it indicates is that for the black women of the lowest intellectual social class, which are rural farm women, generally the education is least, the average number of children is 5.4. For women with college degrees, it's 1.9. And so this is definitely unfavorable. It is reproducing far more at the bottom end and not enough to keep even at the top end.
Dr. Shackley, can
for whites, let me just finish this. For whites, the numbers are also in this direction, but nowhere nearly as severe.
You know, from a child up, I always, at first, I wanted to be white, you know, because my family was 20 of us, 6 girls and 14 boys. We would make 50 and 60 bales of cotton, gather all that cotton, and we wouldn't have food in the wintertime. So I figured then the white people must be right. But as I got older, I said, no, it's something wrong. And if I ever get a chance, I'm going to do something about it.
My community is the larger American community.
a community built of law-abiding citizens who want to make sure that they can raise their children and their families in a country that they recognize, in a country that is run by radicals, in a country that is free, radical individuals and socialists screaming and demanding justice and setting fires and rioting and looting businesses.
Jesus Christ.
What?
Another damn.
Read the note, not read it.
Warning. Do not inform police. Learn your weapon and wait for instructions. Learn your weapon and wait for instructions. Warning. Do not inform police. Freedom is near. Hey. Hey. Oh.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong.
The Watts want race war. Kill them.
Yo, fool. We gonna be free.
Bitch, I am free. I've been free. Shut your young ass up. You don't know nothing about this. This is some old jailhouse shit. I guess now I'm gonna violate my parole and be a repeat offender.
Racist policeman. Numerous other things here, if you want me to mention them, we'll say here. Now we've got to get these four-legged and two-legged beasts. We know none of them, of the brothers and sisters, are going to stand for this dog business.
Well, what's the motive behind this sort of? What's the motive behind this sort of propaganda, Mr. Kowaleski?
I'll tell you what it is: to stir up the hostility between the police and the members of the minority group. You saw two perfect examples here tonight of why there is hostility toward the police. Just take one good long look at Reverend Clee when he says that we are the enemy, that we are the invader. And this is the man that says here that white policemen are the ones who are enforcing the laws for the white power structure. What is Reverend Clee going to do when he...
Shut up! This is the uprising.
Rise my ass. Ain't nobody asked me shit.
Anytime a black person is brutalized by the police, he goes into court and he's arrested for assault and battery. Now, the basic issue is so simple, and nobody will even touch it because you're afraid to touch it. You are deliberately trying to evade the issue. Everybody is talking about...
Consequently, we are asking for these rifles. We want to prevent trouble. We're not asking, they said we're out here trying to kill black people. We're trying to save everybody's people. We're not out here to kill anybody. And we need some defense. I think that the people have a demand for protection of property and their life. We're not out here to kill people.
Before. But I've always wanted a little house in the country with a big apple tree in the front yard.
What? You need to be thinking about 3 hots and a cot. That'll be more like it. That's if we didn't get killed, which we would.
Executive Secretary of the NAACP in the city of Detroit condemns the police because they didn't put force into the riot area soon enough. Now, do they want force or don't they want force? I also hear about this high-powered rifle and so forth. In this same book, it tells you how they do it in the other countries. In the other countries, they arm their police riot squads with machine guns. They have special lead capes in England. And all over the world, they're giving their police the tools to do the job. Now, the people have to make their mind up. Do they want riots? Let me...
Take us home. Do it! Well, this is the uprising. Hand over your watch and your house. You'll be like a house jacket.
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt you for just a minute to ask Dr. Reese, in view of the fact that Detroit is a very familiar neighborhood to him, his headquarters are in Ann Arbor, about this in terms of weapons, and then I want to go for a reaction to Dr. Poussaint about this whole issue of lethal weapons and non-lethal weapons. Do they achieve any salubrious objective?
I doubt whether an armed police in the sense of the stoner rifle is what we want in a democratic society.
We'll keep this space open. This is the last stronghold for civil discourse. After this shit, it's just rat-a-tat, tat-a-tat, tat-tat-tat-tat.
The divine is beyond the power of words to define. But some people think that if you name it, you can claim it. When that happens, don't get caught in the middle. That's about to happen to this young priest. He's about to get caught in the middle of the cosmic slop.
Now is not the time for trickery and tomfoolery.
I'd like to begin by establishing some kind of a frame of reference. Exactly what are we talking about?
Frequently, the definition and effects of racism are greatly misunderstood.
In 1966, that is going to stop.
Well, my theory was, I wrote the paper in 1969. I wrote a paper called The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism. And the sole reason behind writing that paper was an attempt to understand the behavior of white people in relationship to all people of color, every place in the world, black, brown, red, and yellow people. And the paper was presented to the Americans at the National Medical Association, the section on psychiatry in neurology, because back in 1969, the Black Caucus in the American Psychiatric Association, we had said that racism, and when we talk about racism, we're talking about the white supremacy behavior of white people. That racism was the #1 mental health problem in the nation, and it was the #1 cause of other mental health problems. And I wanted to understand what this thing of racism really is all about, because it's it is the thing that has caused woe and misery and suffering for the vast majority of the people on this planet that are classified as non-white. And in my attempt to understand why the necessity of white people to keep saying that white is superior and that the condition of non-white is inferior. And the more I thought about it, in conjunction with an idea that a friend of mine had, that racism was a worldwide behavioral system for the maintenance of white supremacy by a small minority of people, I put those ideas together with what we know about genetics, what we know about the condition of skin whiteness itself. The condition of skin whiteness is the genetic inability to produce skin pigment called melanin. This is a genetic recessive trait. It is a genetic deficiency state, not as defined by Francis Welsing, but defined by geneticists and dermatologists, that the inability to produce the skin pigment of melanin or melanin pigment is described as albinism. And I think that white people, even though most white people are not consciously understanding their problem in genetics, they are certainly aware that they are genetically dominated by people of color. That's why it was a statement, one drop of black blood makes you black, because people of color have the genetic capacity to annihilate white people. And so unless white people control the reproductivity of people of color, then we can postulate that perhaps one day there won't be any white people. And I think that the very survival of white people necessitates that they project genetic inferiority on people of color, because it is they who really are aware that they are genetic recessive and perhaps genetically inferior to people of color. And I am not saying this to call the condition of skin whiteness to say, well, no, white people are inferior. I'm not saying it for that purpose, but I think that it is of prime importance for the majority of people in the world to understand why it is that white people have to, the effective majority, large numbers of white people, have to move in a hostile and an aggressive way against people of color, and have to constantly focus on it's you who's genetically inferior, because they realize that there's something wrong with their genetic status. Now,
May I take a call?
Oh, sure,
All right.
please.
An operational definition of individual racism is subordination of a person or group because of race. But we will focus on the institutional practice of racism, when a group is subordinated by factors indirectly related to race.
More than interesting proposition that America is institutionally racist.
Well, let me say that's a long question. Let me point out one aspect. It's a question that calls for a very long answer. I think I might just at this point say that in a time like 1 hour, we may expose a problem and encourage thinking about it, and this is a very valuable thing.
There is a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. There is a certain class of race problem solvers who don't want the patient to get well. That was said by Booker T. Washington.
And let me mention one thing, which is that in certain areas there is no doubt about black superiority. Blacks are superior.
It has been said before, but I will repeat it.
There is no doubt about black superiority, and they're superior in a systematic way. Now, I don't expect that people will understand the details of this, but I simply want to show that quantitative work can be done. This happens to be a research job of my own, and what it shows, because these points that you see here lie on a line, which is not the central line, but they lie systematically on a line, what it says is blacks are systematically better than whites. It's as if their bell-shaped curve, their distribution curve, were pushed upwards compared to whites, such that it would mean that the average IQ distribution would be up by 9 points rather than down by about 15 points, which is the typical average.
So when you take out the trash, think about what else needs to go with it.
I'm out of here.
That's the thing that makes this program possible. The First Amendment, which allows freedom of speech. If one believes that is not the right answer, then one has to be one of the most anti-German racists there can be. If one believes that the German people would have tolerated the concentration camps and the gas chambers, if news media, like the programs that Mr. Brown is setting on, if those people were willing to bring discordant views out into the open, I don't believe the concentration camps and the gas chambers could have continued to exist in Germany.
The proposition that America is institutionally racist requires that something creates an environment.
What the lesson of Nazi history we have in this country, and it will protect us.
Two things create an environment for slavery or racism, and they are needed for it to exist.
My research leads me inescapably to the opinion that the major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficits is hereditary.
One is a social contract, as in the South during slavery.
And racially genetic in origin.
Two, codified law.
And thus not remediable to a major degree by practical improvements in environment.
You must address the foundation and the factors. Education, a family structure.
It's evidence for a genetic difference, in
well,
my
you see
opinion.
what I'm saying? There might be many, many more genetic differences where people of color appear superior.
In the 1960s, 80+% of blacks were two-parent homes. Today, that is reversed completely the other way. It has a lot of factors, which includes entitlement systems, the growth of liberalism to a point of progressivism beyond any imagined course.
I'd like to comment because I'd like to say that I don't think that there's a major difference between what Dr. Shackley is doing. I don't think that Dr. Shackley is fully aware of what he is doing and why he is doing what he's doing. But the long-range implications of what he is doing are no different than the propaganda campaign that Hitler and his Nazi unit carried on in Germany that ended up eliminating 6 million Jewish people. Now, what is most interesting is that Hitler said the very same thing. He said, number one, that the Jews were genetically inferior to the Aryans. Number two, he was aware that the Semites had genetically dominant material, genetic material to the Aryans. And if we begin to understand the way that people who were in Europe at the time that the Semites arrived from Africa, when the Semites arrived in Europe from Africa, they were people who had substantial amounts of color and who had very kinky hair because they were from the continent of Africa. And the Europeans, the white people who were there, had a reaction, a color reaction to the Semites that is no different than the reaction and the concern on the part of people who are white in this area of the world or any other area of the world to people who have the genetic capacity to produce color, who can genetically annihilate their position. And I think it's very, very important, even though Dr. Shackley, I am convinced that Dr. Shackley believes that he is perhaps elevating science with all of his charts and all of his figures, but he doesn't understand the things that propel him as a white individual in a social system that has programmed him throughout his life and programmed large numbers of people like him to focus on the genetics of people of color in such a way as to destroy people of color.
And when it comes to single parentage of anyone of any ethnicity, a single mother has a higher likelihood significantly of being in poverty, therefore raising a child in poverty. I'm addressing foundation because it is easy to argue, as my colleagues have, the emotion.
Well, there are enormous differences. In fact, the lesson to be learned from Nazi history is frequently very misunderstood, and it is a lesson which Mr. Brown has told us about earlier. It's the First Amendment. It's not that eugenics is intolerable. Actually, the eugenic programs, which are the opposite of dysgenics, eugenic programs are not inconceivable, they're not inhumane. Denmark has been carrying out programs with strong eugenic implications for maybe 30 years. And it's important to note that since World War II, Denmark's per capita homicide rate dropped and is now approximately 1/20th. That is, the number of deaths of probability of being killed in a year by a violent homicide is roughly, the order of 100 times less for young Danes than it is for young American blacks.
Give me my damn freedom or kill me.
That the American Negro is either going to be free or he's going to be dead.
We're going to be free. Now, you kill all you want to, but we kill too.
What the hell do you think we care about dying if you're going to deny us the right to live? We want agreement by which we can live or die. You choose.
I came to the conclusion that the dominant never cede power willingly.
Every bargain ain't a bargain. An example would be a union with all white members. You can only get in the union if a member sponsors you, and automatically whites select one another. So this pattern of selection automatically keeps blacks out. The union is white in the first place because its membership reflects the leftover patterns of slavery. Therefore, racist behavior is both intentional and unintentional. Our institutions mostly involve unsuspecting individuals who are part of a racist pattern.
So we're going to play the video, we'll stop it, we'll discuss.
Then come back to it and deal with it.
Make some interesting arguments.
To grant us human dignity!
The basic assumption of this video is that if your grandparents are rich in the United States, this means that you are rich in the United States. And that if your grandparents are poor in the United States, that means that you are poor in the United States.
Get the white devil. Get the devil.
The biggest problem that we have in the United States right now is an historic wealth gap. We have is an income gap in the United States. And
get the white devil. I can give you a very good reason. If this TV camera can pick this up, here it is.
Income changes over time to wealthy.
My community is not a group of men that do drugs. It's not a group of men who taser police officers. It's not a group of men who assault police officers or don't want to listen to basic instructions.
Because of the seriousness of the condition that our people now find themselves in, that it's absolutely impossible to solve our problems with means other than religion, to stand on our own feet, and instead of trying to force ourselves upon whites or force ourselves into the white society or blame the white man for our predicament and constantly beg him for what he has, the only way that we can solve our problem is to unite together among ourselves, among our own kind, clean ourselves up, rid ourselves of the evils that we've become addicted to here in this society, and try and solve our problem ourselves.
Should we be put down and shot to death for this request? If so, you can aim your guns.
Or else I'll be dead.
I'm thinking about in terms of a better and a greater world for all people. And we can't do that by me in one corner doing what I can do to hurt you and you in the other corner doing the same thing against me.
We have businesses around the country that are patronized by whites, and we have many businesses here in Chicago, and our customers are white as well as our own kind.
There is no such thing as a race.
And a white person can go into any of these places of business, and he'll have to admit that he is treated with more respect, and he finds more dignity there then he will find among the so-called Negroes who profess to be teaching love for everyone.
Nature created no races.
Negro is a term that was applied to us during slavery by the slave master. And right today, it's a term that is used only to point out the descendant of slaves. It's never used for black people, period. Africans can come to this country. They aren't called Negroes. And if they are called Negroes, they resent it. So if Negro meant black, as we've been taught, it would be a term that would be applicable to or pliable to everyone. But he says that it is something that means a slave, or something who is, it means something that has been left out of society, politically, economically, educationally, and otherwise.
Man created races, racial classifications, and he had his own reason for doing it.
Think of it as an anthropological term.
Definitely. It's not an anthropological term, it's a slave term. And it was a term that was invented in America and was used by the slave makers, slave traders, and slave masters, and attached to the property or the chattel or merchandise that our people represented in that particular day.
Mr. O'Connor.
Now, who benefited from this artificial creation at first? Who benefits from it now? Now,
we're trying to gain acceptance. So the idea was to imitate the black. I mean, whatever you want it to be. You want to be a black businessman,
so you spoke as the black businessman would speak, and you would dress as he dressed with the three-piece suits, and you would act that way to gain acceptance, you see, and you would talk, so forth and so on, and you wore an Ivy League haircut the same way that he did, and so forth and so on.
Well, coming into the late 50s and the 60s and finding out that we're so disillusioned by what is happening, because prejudice and racism, of course, it does not exist in all white people, but there's enough that kicks everybody in the backside so that you know that there are enough people who are against you because you are black, that you become paranoid, which is not an evil word to say, because there are white people who are paranoid.
And it's just shocking. I mean, it's shocking how many war crimes were committed on camera. And it's just amazing the propaganda that's just told to us about what this is and why they have the right to kill people that pose no threat to them.
And I think I don't think we've gone over it too well.
This is the streets talking for themselves. They don't need me right now.
Shit, many fans as I got. Could be anybody. Could be Bambi, Conchita, Monique, Jaja, Shaniqua.
Well, what luck? There's a note.
Could you read it to me? Quit playing. Come read it.
Okay. Well, hey, you can read it to some big man. It is kind of pathetic when a man's wife got to read him his little love notes. Look, just remember now, Jaja, that begins with a Z. Now, if that is from a woman, I suggest you put it in the sink before opening it.
Or do we need to address criminality altogether? Should it be the criminals that get into trouble? Should we stop protesting on behalf of criminals that get into trouble?
Well, we love America. But you are driving us back and you are making a Samson out of us, and we are going to pull down the pillars.
It should not be particularly surprising.
To Black America, what is it that we want?
Let me begin by suggesting that the clearest evidence of racism in education is the essential control over black education, both in so-called integrated settings and in segregated settings by white people, many of whom are incapable of responding to the people they're educating as people, many of whom are incapable of understanding the culture and the history of the people they're educating, many of whom really do not see any kind of responsibility for involving these communities and managing their own education. A second kind of aspect is the ability of white communities to keep black people out of their communities and still yet exercise some influence over the education in black communities. That is, even when there's no blacks in the white community, whites are still having some kind of influence over the education in black communities. A third example is the way in which our schools are organized. Despite the fact that we know we live in a racist society, the schools continue to be organized as though racism does not exist. That is, there's been no real shift of power within the school. There's been no effective change in the content. There's been no forthright recognition of the politics involved in education. For instance, in New York City, about 55% of the students are black and Puerto Rican, yet we have one black and one Puerto Rican member on a school board of 5 people. So 3 white people are making decisions that affect 55% of people whom they may not be able to respect as people.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities.
So let's talk for a second about school policy. The reality is that if you wanted Jamal to be able to go to Kevin's school, what you'd want is something called school vouchers. You want people to be able to move away from their school districts. One of the chief reasons that Jamal is confined to his local public school is because of Democratic policy that has decided that you must go to school in the district where you live. And this is also why a lot of people have left lower income areas and moved out to higher income areas specifically for better public schools. So if you want Jamal to have the same educational opportunities as Kevin, perhaps you should have school vouchers for private schools, or perhaps you should have charter schools, which is what Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York is fighting against, or perhaps you should break the teachers' unions, which are costing a fortune, particularly on a disproportionate level in areas where they're not spending enough taxpayer dollars. So I'm all for improving Jamal's schools. I'm also all for Jamal having all the same educational opportunities as Kevin. The problem is most Democrats are not.
Let me put it to you this way. We are proud of being black and of our black heritage, but white America does not accept the concept that this is a multiracial society. It has never accepted the fact that there are black people, brown people, yellow people here alongside them. They've always looked upon America as being white, and hence all of its propaganda is directed at us to convince us that somehow or other we must become white before they will accept us.
Many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race.
Why is it that black people don't own the land where they live? White people own that land. We've never been taught property values. You see, we've never been taught property values. I don't own Harlem, for example. Black people don't own Harlem. So who gives a damn whether Harlem burned down or not? How you gonna tell me to love this property that exploits me every day when the average black man in Harlem works the first Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for a landlord?
Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias.
Not only have whites tried to deceive blacks about the realities, but they, in effect, deceived each other about the realities. That is, I'm sitting here thinking about the institutions in society, all of which are racist, you know, which whites created and which whites have used in order to advance themselves, but never at any point stopping and recognizing, for instance, that the prisons have nothing to do with rehabilitation, or that the courts, in most cases, really have nothing to do with justice.
Redlining became illegal in the United States as early as 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975, which was a predecessor to the Community Reinvestment Act, both of which were an attempt to ensure that people who were living in low-income minority neighborhoods could actually get loans. And these things were very effective. In 1992, researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data. They collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions. They found that virtually all of the difference between minority and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables. A reanalysis of that information found that black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at higher rates than they were lending to black-owned businesses. Furthermore, if it seemed that banks were discriminating against black borrowers on the basis of they needed to have higher credit qualifications, what you would see is lower default rates from black clients of banks, from people who are borrowing money from banks in the black community. There are zero studies that show any of this. So the bottom line is this. Redlining was an evil and awful policy. It was made illegal in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the banks were not lending at disproportionate rates. In fact, if you look at among different communities, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out, Asian Americans get loans more easily than white Americans. That does not mean the banks are being racist toward white Americans on behalf of Asian Americans. When it comes to college education, it is also worth noting that, yes, there were many universities that were segregated. There were many universities that did not allow black people to attend. Since the 1970s, the most prominent measure that has been used in order to admit black students to major universities across the country has been affirmative action, which actively discriminates against people who are not black in favor of black applicants, specifically by ensuring that black applicants don't have to have the same test scores or GPAs in order to get into those same schools. So not only has policy been corrected, it's been overcorrected in these areas.
What about schools?
Well,
What specifically is a racist pattern, in your opinion, as far as the educational process or the schools is concerned?
Well, I would say that the overwhelming educational process that is racist is a tendency to educate people against their own interests. That is, to educate black kids to hate themselves, to educate blacks to feel alienated from their own people, to educate blacks to become advocates for the mainstream against their own community.
Well, how is that done, specifically?
Well, I would say that, you know, the traditional educational process is, number one, the concealing of the truth about history, the educating of black students away from the problems of their own community. For instance, very few black students on college campuses are enabled to use their minds to work on the problems that bedevil the black community, like sickle cell anemia, or the housing problems, the drug problems that are imposed on the black community by the outside. Very few black students on white campuses or any campus are spending their energies and their minds on trying to find solutions to those problems. In most cases, they're being educated, say, with a drug problem to learn how to use methadone. You know.
These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Now, the role of institutions in a society is to reflect the power that controls that society. So we have American institutions arrayed against us. And we naively expect these institutions to reform themselves, because if they reform themselves, that's tantamount to presiding over their own demise.
Yeah, I've observed that myself. I of course, would put a different coloration on it than the other side.
Yeah, since there's a need for brevity, I'll make my question as short as possible. If one does an historical analysis of the situation as it exists in the world at present, there's an increasing tendency on the part of third world countries to gravitate towards the socialist ideal, whatever it may be. And I'd like both sides of the fence to address the question as to why this is so. Is it an ineptness on the part of radicals and intellectuals, or is it a clear analysis of historical perspectives?
Mixed up minds. If we could understand that black psychology is the psychology that the black man has to have if he's going to escape from powerlessness in a white man's world. Now, the struggle is a struggle between black people for power and white people to keep power. Now, all we're dealing with is a power struggle. Every institution that the white man has, he uses in this power struggle. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing immoral about it. Any people would do that. When we get on top, we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to use every institution to perpetuate black power. And the white man's going to have to fight up from the bottom again for another, 100 million years trying to get back to a position of power. There's nothing wrong with fighting for power, but the thing that's wrong is for powerless people to accept their powerlessness and to accept the definition by which they are maintained powerless and to accept the institutions which perpetuate their powerlessness. So that's why I think the black church has to become a power base for black people in changing this total institutional conception structure that black people are living in. We've got to use it as a base to spin off all the institutions that black people need that come from a black perspective, a black orientation, and are concerned with black power.
For white people. So the average black man ain't got nothing to lose by anything that he does. And this is what the white man better understand. Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. Simple. As ABC. Or as 1, 2, 3, any way you go. There's no need asking me why these black people burning down these buildings out here. Hell, they got a positive answer, and people are not as dumb as people would think. With all the brilliant white psychiatrists and psychologists, you've been able to find a damn path to the moon, but you ain't been able to find one goddamn path 1 mile up the street. Maybe you better take time with just all this unique ability to find all these scientific discoveries that you've got to learn how to find your way into men's hearts and the men's mind.
We'd use them first to unscramble our own mixed up minds.
Honor thy mother and thy father. Even though it was my father that was whooping up on my mother's ass. See, but that's how the Lord tests us. And then I met you. God, and you just seem so tortured and so angry. And I said to myself, now here's a man who understands pain, who hurts as much as I do. I can just help him. Oh, I know he'll love me and to protect me forever. Oh, baby, now God has sent us a gun and a note. Just tell me all my suffering would have been for something.
What if it's a trick?
As you know, Mr. President, I have been a lifelong card-carrying Republican. And yet I was always a good soldier for the party. I sincerely believed, and still believe, that black people need to learn how to stand on their own 2 feet without the crutches of governmental legislation. But I'm afraid I must protest in the strongest terms possible what I've heard in this room today. What is being proposed cannot be passed off euphemistically as
dysgenics.
At its best, it is group banishment. At its worst, it is utter and complete extermination.
Italy, for example, they came to the brink of Euro-communism and backed off. In France, they had a socialist government and backed away from it. I don't think you can fool the people anymore the way you could in the 30s in an industrial civilized society by saying, you know, we want socialism because we don't want to promise you pie in the sky. We want to make you rich here on earth, and socialism is the way to make you rich. That was the original promise of socialism. Money, food, shelter, work, but, you know, a good job and rewarding income. Now, that's just, you know, been completely disproved by, quote, historical analysis, by facts. And the only place you can get away with it now is with people who aren't that well educated. Now, I hope that's not taken as an ad hominem. That's my hypothesis as to, you know, why it is that it is not possible to spread true socialism in an advanced society.
Will they be ready for democracy when they stop eating each other?
You were concerned about the process. I think we got to understand that there's no such thing as objective truth, which is implicit in everything Dr. Clark says. That white people use the institutions to accomplish white purpose. The white purpose is to maintain a power position and keep everybody else in a subordinate, powerless kind of position. Now that's the institution's purpose, and that's the way it functions and how it functions. And we got to realize then that everything that the schools teach is designed to fit into that purpose.
I think the more advanced and intellectual countries have learned that socialism just does not work. So the only place that socialism can be sold now is in very backward countries that are in effect still following the fashions of the 1930s.
Funny as to signal my disagreement with the perspective of Mr. Binswanger.
We need to look at what kind of societies did black people come out of? What happened before this interference? Now, we came out of basic pluralistic societies, but we came out of sharing societies where nobody was very rich and nobody at all was poor. Now, an African in these societies would no more kill a deer and say, this is mine, than he would fly, because he didn't think that way. He thought of all property as belonging to the total community. Now, we were brought into a society as slaves just at the time the concept of private property and capitalism was getting well underway with the backing of the church. Now, there is a clash between the values of, the best values of the society we came out of and the society that enslaved us. And too many of us are tied up with these values, the sacredness of private property. What is so sacred about private property? What is so sacred about one man taking upon himself more than he could use in a lifetime while people walking by this mountain of wealth starving? Nothing
socialism has been popular is that you have to conceive of the world economy as a gigantic division of labor in which most of those countries' economies have been pretty much at the behest of the core economies in the world, the advanced capitalist countries, in which they've been structured in such a way as to benefit those core economies, but not to benefit themselves. So you have sort of single crop agriculture, primarily for export. You have no internal market in those countries. And the ruling elites that go away to school and come back get it into their heads that in order to change that around, they have to have some form of a command economy where they take control of their own society and their economy. Now, when they've done that and when they've experimented with it, while sometimes they've found that they do need elements of a market and then foreign capital is attractive. But that's the reason that that element of the socialist idea appeals in those countries.
Let's look at this in principle. Let's not try and say, well, maybe because it was raining in South Yemen when they took over, it was a bad time for them to take over, and that's why socialism failed. And maybe because Afghanistan went this way, and because Cuba's dependent on one crop, and because, you know, there's always an explanation ad hoc as to why every single socialist nation that takes socialism seriously ends up with concentration camps and mass slaughter. Let's look at it in principle. In principle, what else can you expect if the government owns all the property in the country? If there is no right to private property, if you cannot own your own printing press, for example, from which you can criticize the government, if the state owns all the printing presses, all the radios, if the means of making a living is in the hands of one group which maintains it by force, the government, so that he who does not work shall not eat, becomes a government edict, what else can you expect? If you make it a crime to trade on the black market, in other words, to engage in capitalist acts, yet people have to engage in these black market activities in order to feed themselves, what else can you expect but more and more black market and more repression to keep it down? There's no escape from a system of any statist kind leading to disaster if it gives all that power to the government. Now, the capitalist system says the most dangerous thing in the world is a government. Let's restrain it. Let's keep it down. Let's give it only one function, the function of protecting your freedom from criminals and foreign aggressors. Let's not let it mess in any other area of your life. Let's just have the police and the law courts, and let's not have it be also your employer and the owner of everything. So, in other words, we believe in very, very drastically restricted, limited government. Now, since government's the culprit here, doesn't that point to the answer to your question?
Of the plight of the black man in this country, there's been no perceptible change. Well, primarily because the white man has no reason to. He enjoys the highest standard of living. His government enjoys dominance in world affairs. Why should he turn to me now and say, I want to share part of my good fortune with you? He has no reason to.
I think there's going to be violence.
Really reluctantly, because I had really believed always in the collegial, meditative, discussive experiment. I really believed that, and I do believe in a democracy, totally. I mean, I do believe that change is possible. But I also believe that property rights are sacred, that the power of the dominant class is not easily shared. And I came to reluctantly accept the observations of Mao Zedong that more or less permanent revolution is needed in order to secure effective social change. It's a horrible thing for a police chief to say.
This revolution is filled with so many ironies, really. First you tell us that it is manly to keep your word. All right, if you are a man, you keep your word. And now all that the black people in this country are demanding, and even the black people in the whole world are demanding, is that you keep your word. You told us we were free. Well then, show us that we're free. You told us that there is justice, equality for all in this country. Well then, stick to your word. And let us see the justice and equality for all. Or else admit to us that you're not a man, you're a worm, you're afraid of us, you're afraid to give us equal stand. You're afraid that if you give us equal ground, that we will match you and we will override you. And if that's what you're afraid of us, then tell us that just what you're afraid of. But don't keep hiding it from us and holding this up to us, and every time we ask you for something, you give us a little bit of something, and it's all tokenism. We don't want tokenism. And there are most black men in this world that don't want charity. And yet still every time we ask you for something, you give us a little piece, a little piece. You're playing games with us. We're not children. We're big men. I've seen my father have to put up with all kinds of stuff. He was a big man. He raised a family. He went down south, and he had to go around to the back door with his wife. We're not asking for anything. We're not asking for any favors. All we want is what's ours.
Executive type motherfuckers just looking for somebody just like you.
I'm willing to admit that. I'm willing to admit that is the natural trend.
What's wrong with you today?
What we want is to have absolutely zero personal responsibility. We want to be able to point to the white boogeyman for all of our problems and all the circumstances that we are in.
That sound like a man's job to you?
It's not about unarmed black men anymore. It's about armed black men being protected now.
I just think it's part of capitalism is to promote racism, you know, right? In order to make things work. If you feel better because you're white and you can get a job, you use that. I mean, you know, I would.
Absolutely.
Say, I'm sorry, Jack, but shit, they say I'm white. I'm going to use this.
Right, absolutely.
Get this job. I'm hungry, you know. But, and that separates people. So they keep people separated, and that keeps them from thinking about the real problem. That's as simple as I see it. Probably it's not that simple, but...
No, all right.
We want black privilege. We're accusing people of wanting white privilege. We want special privileges. We want to be able to fire at police officers, to assault them, and to make it home, and to tell police officers, maybe try later. Maybe later I want to be arrested.
Probably kill myself after you leave. Probably just get too drunk one night. You know how I get. I don't know, just jump out the window or something. I don't know. Oh, well.
All right. You and I are about the same age, right? We're in our mid-30s. How long is it going to take before guys who think like you, and I say guys who think like me, people who don't want to have racism in the country, people who don't want to be oppressing any minority, whatever it is, sexual, whatever minority, really get into positions of power and can change things.
You can't get in a position of power, it seems, if you think like that. It seems that the only time you get in a position of power is if you like the people that are in power. To me, I mean, that's the way it goes. I mean, people that get to become executives become like the people that were already executives.
I don't know, maybe...
They go in with good intentions, but...
We can't pretend that what we're looking for is equality. We're not looking for equality.
It eats them up. It's like a cesspool, you know, it just gets on you and it starts
the system
eating.
levels them.
Right? We had equality. We got bored with equality. Now we want something more. We want to be treated differently. We want special privileges.
Pretty soon it's all
Is that
gone.
what a cesspool sounds like?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. We'll be back right after this. Here's
Okay.
a good guy, Richard Pryor.
Just let me go get my coat.
Better not forget my goddamn kitchen. Come on. Hey, move! Shit. Get off me now! Shit.
Because you have no concern for the Negroes.
Who were rallying to protest the brutal shooting of 7 unarmed Negroes
And what did you
by
say?
heavily armed white policemen in the city of Los Angeles. And because we are a people who have been taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad to never carry weapons of any kind, but to get on God's side and rely on God to fight our battles for us, at the time that these brothers were shot down so brutally, I pointed out at the funeral of the brother who died that God would step in and take a hand in giving us some form of justice for the brutal killing of our brother. And when the plane crashed in France, I pointed out to the crowd at this rally that this was an act of God showing his wrath or complete resentment over the brutal form of injustice that had been inflicted upon our poor unarmed brothers.
Were you saying
Sir,
that, or do
Billy
you believe
Graham, at that time, Dr. Billy Graham was in a crusade in Chicago, and the press, your papers here in this city, quoted Billy Graham of also saying that that plane crash was an act of God.
All definitions of black people's standards and values have been defined by whites in a society basically European. As simple as it may seem, we have never made any definition of our condition, beauty standards, social etiquette. Even our names have been given us by white culture.
And if it doesn't look proper for a person who is yellow or Chinese to be walking around named Murphy or Jones or Johnson or Bunch or Powell, I think it would be just as improper for a black person or the so-called Negro in this country, as we're taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, to walk around with these names. And therefore he teaches us that during slavery, the same slave master who owned us put his last name on us to denote that we were his property. So that when you see a Negro today who's named Johnson, if you go back in his history, you'll find that he was once his grandfather or one of his forefathers was owned by a white man who was named Johnson. If his name is Bunch, his grandfather was owned by a white man that was named Bunch.
The research is actually a lot more interesting than what is being portrayed in this video. There are several studies here. There was one famous study that was done that suggested that first name differentiation was indeed being used by employers. So if your name was Lakeisha, for example, this is the name that is actually used in the study, Lakeisha versus Greg, that you are less likely to get a callback. There was another study that showed a historically black last name like Washington or Jefferson provided no actual differentiation from historically white names, like Greenberg, for example. So if your name was Steve Greenberg versus Steve Jefferson, you're just as likely to get a callback as Steve Jefferson. What that suggests, and this was confirmed by subsequent studies, is that the actual issue here is a question of class discrimination, not an issue of race discrimination. In other words, the reason that people are discriminating against Lakeisha as opposed to against Steve Johnson or Steve Washington is because people are actually using the first name as a stand-in for social class. They are figuring that if you were named Lakeisha, it's because you probably came from a more impoverished background. Now, this is not restricted to the black community. This happens in the Jewish community as well. If you get an applicant, and the applicant's name is Ben, you might treat that applicant different than if that person's name is Benjamin. You might treat a Menachem different than you treat a Mike. And that is because you are trying to read into the person your perceptions of culture or perceptions of class, not really perceptions of race. That's really, really important when you look at these particular studies and suggest that racial discrimination rather than class distinctions are at the basis of whatever hiring discrimination is happening here.
Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment.
I was a very wayward, criminal, backward, illiterate, uneducated and whatever other negative characteristics you can think of, type of person. And because of the impact that it had upon me in giving me a desire to reform myself and rehabilitate myself for the first time in my life, and also being able to see the effect that it had upon others, this is what made me accept it. And plus, prior to hearing what he teaches, I had no interest whatsoever in anything serious or any kind of educational pursuits. And I noticed that after being exposed immediately, it instilled within me such a high degree of racial pride and racial dignity that I wanted to be somebody, and I realized that I couldn't be anybody by begging the white man for what he had, but that I had to get out here and try and do something for myself or make something out of myself.
No, I don't want you to take this the wrong way.
Would you like to be my girl?
Or get all mad or nothing. Well, when was the last time you went looking for a job?
How many goddamn times do I have to tell you this? It ain't no jobs out here for the black man. The system is keeping me... You can't see how the system is keeping me down? Huh?
Yes.
If a person is sitting on a warm stove and you get ready to let him up, no matter how slow you are, he has patience because it's only warm. But the masses of black people who are sitting on a hot stove, they're impatient. And no matter how fast you say progress is being made toward letting them up, that progress is not fast enough for them.
That's really, really important.
Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment.
Well, this tends to neglect one key factor. What did you major in? What did you study? It turns out that people who major in education aren't going to do as well as people who major in engineering. According to research from the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University, this is a quote from PBS, African-American college students are more likely to pursue majors that lead to low-paying jobs, setting up many for future debt and underemployment. Over time, these occupational choices contribute to the wealth and opportunity gap between whites and blacks that spans generations. Anthony Carnival, who's the director of the program, says basically, African-Americans have been going to the right church but sitting in the wrong pew. In a way, they are using education to climb the social and economic ladder, but they're being steered toward majors that will make them low earners. So, in other words, there are several confounding factors that are not being taken into account in this video. 1, what college did you go to? 2, what did you major in? And 3, what kind of job did you get afterward?
To just take one Negro and stick him in college with the aid of 15,000 troops and at a cost of $6,000 is a disgrace. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. It's a farce. It's hypocrisy. Because if it's right for one Negro to be forced into that university, then every Negro in the state of Mississippi who is qualified has the same right to go to that university. And if the government is not ready and willing to enforce the right of every Negro in the state of Mississippi, then, in my opinion, sir, it's only hypocrisy to pretend that they are for justice by pushing one Negro in and blowing it up all over the world to make it look like they're solving the problem when millions of black people in that state are still going to segregated schools. Do we have a thorough knowledge of ourselves, of our own kind, and racial dignity?
It should not be particularly surprising that discrimination in the past has impact on the actual income of people who are living in the areas that were denied loans. That shouldn't be a major surprise. But that is not the only disparity, obviously. That New York Times piece they are citing says, quote, they estimate the maps account for 15 to 30% of the overall gaps in segregation and home ownership that they find between the highest risk area and the second highest risk areas. Those were the ones that were being classified. The truth is that when it comes to redlining, you have to look at the gradations as well. There is always going to be a difference in the availability of loans to people who are living in the highest risk areas as opposed to the people who are in the very lowest risk areas.
What is being proposed cannot be passed off euphemistically.
Another factor is that if history does make a difference, then if you are denied loans in a particular area, and if there's less money in those areas, and as crime goes up, and as property taxes kick in, there's not enough money to take, and as schools get worse, obviously that's going to continue to have effect in that particular area. That doesn't mean the same people are living in that area who always lived in that area, or that people who grew up in that area in 1960 necessarily have to live in that area, or that their grandkids have to live in that area in 2020.
We don't want your schools, but we want our schools to be the highest and the best possible for our black progeny. See, what people don't understand, we are saying, and we're not asking. You see, the die is cast, as I said, we're not asking, we're saying this is the way it's going to be.
The studies that supposedly determine that your implicit bias results in real-world action are deeply flawed. Implicit bias assessment tests, for example, are so significantly flawed they are virtually unusable.
Unusable. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university.
Then we can go to anyone's school and we'll still retain our race pride, our racial dignity, and we will be able to avoid the subservient inferiority complex that most Negroes have that is instilled within most Negroes who receive this sort of integrated education.
Malcolm, how do you yourself feel about the white man?
I believe that the white man has done a great injustice to the black man in this country by having kidnapped our people and brought us here and down to the level that we're on today. And today, instead of approaching the factors that their original mistake has created, instead of approaching these factors objectively and realistically, the greatest sin that they're doing now is trying to pretend that they never committed a crime, that they never did any wrong. And when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad points out the injustices that our people are suffering, they make that sin worse by accusing him of teaching hate, or by accusing him of black supremacy, or by accusing him of advocating violence, simply because he is pointing out the real factors in the problem.
We have a little time left. You don't have to hurry so.
Every bargain ain't a bargain. America kind of let the brothers and sisters down. Let me see if I can call them aliens back. I'm gonna tell them we're having a 1-cent sale. They can get the rest of y'all for a penny.
Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances.
As it turns out, there are some complicating factors that don't get cited in this video with regard to this data. The Federal Reserve Board economists tried to explain that this data did not take account of differences that were not income-based, things like liabilities, employment history, credit record, and other relevant variables that should have been considered. It should not.
Here's how it works. Let's say a big bank wants a law that would force taxpayers to bail them out again if they repeat the exact same reckless behavior that crashed the global economy in 2008. Not exactly the most popular idea with the public, and Congress knows that. That should be the end of it. But that's where the money comes in. It's perfectly legal for our bank to hire a team of lobbyists whose entire job is to make sure that the government gives the bank what it wants. Then those lobbyists can track down members of Congress who regulate banks and help raise a ton of money for their re-election campaigns. It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm. Then, those lobbyists can literally write the language of this new bailout law themselves and hand it off to the politician they just buttered up with campaign money and lucrative job offers. And it's perfectly legal for those politicians to take the lobbyist-written language and sneak it through Congress at the last second. So now you've got a law that greatly benefits the banks, and the whole process can start over. This is how a bill becomes a law. A special interest hires some lobbyists, those lobbyists collect campaign contributions, offer jobs, and then write the laws that Congress then passes to help those same special interests. This happens every day on every single issue with politicians of both parties. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the United States spent $5.8 billion influencing your government. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. And that's trillion, with a T. And that's just the top 200 companies. Never mind every other special interest, every union, every trade association, and every billionaire. Every single one of them can use their money to buy political influence. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will.
And when it comes to education, there are plenty of affirmative action programs that exist at virtually every major university. In fact, there are entire university systems, like the University of California, that have gotten rid of the SAT and the ACT as admissions criteria specifically because they weren't allowing enough minority students to attend. So to attribute all inequality to systemic racism is simply to say that everything you don't like must be due to systemic racism.
Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with
the melanin content of 2,500 milligrams per square centimeter.
What the hell is melanin?
Doctor.
The amount of melanin in one's skin varies according to how dark or tan we might be. 2,500 milligrams per square centimeter corresponds to the darkness of, what I'd say to be an ordinary paper bag.
Thank you, Doctor. In other news,
Everybody knows police brutality exists.
Kirby, I'd like to also ask
If I gave you this file here that's filled with hundreds of people that have been locked up for carrying guns recently.
I'd like to ask you
Hundreds
another question, Mr. Kovalevsky.
All right.
Do you believe that there has ever been a case of police brutality against a black citizen in the city of Newark?
Now, that all depends on what you consider to be police brutality. I'm going to answer your question.
Physical abuse of a citizen in the city. Physical abuse in the city.
Now, listen, if I was to say that...
Do you believe that there has ever been a case? Let me tell you one little story. Let me tell you one little story.
To Black America, what is it that we want?
Reverend Clegg.
You know what it is. Everybody knows what it is. Now, black people are not going to permit police brutality to go on.
Reverend Clegg.
In any city in America.
Reverend
now,
Clegg.
We had in almost 100 cities race violence last summer. If police brutality continues, we'll have it in 200 cities next summer.
Screaming and demanding justice and setting fires and rioting and looting businesses. That is not the America that I recognize. It is not the America that I want to raise my children. It is not the America that I want to see my family live in. And so I use my voice to speak out against it. My question is, why don't you?
And black people have decided they're not going to tolerate oppression any longer. Now, police brutality is a very deliberate thing. It's a part of American life. America has decided that black people are to be kept in subjection. It's an army of occupation that the white power structure keeps in the black ghetto. We know. Now, don't talk about what is the incident?
Technique. Yes, I have some reactions to that. I think it seems that police are more concerned with putting down riots and enforcing law, and don't seem to be concerned with some of the causes that are leading to some of the distress into the riots. So they react with sort of repressive measures, and we're going to suppress more people, and we're going to kill them, and so on. Now, I think this whole question of these new weapons that police is getting quite out of hand, and I think in particular, besides these rifles, the chemical mace, which is a tear gas spray that's been purchased in large quantities by many police departments around the country.
Before we go into the techniques and technicalities of mace, I want to interrupt to ask Mr. Parcell in Philadelphia, the president of the Detroit Police Officers Association, if he has...
Time.
What?
Girl, don't want me. Bring your little behind in here.
I don't want to watch you pee.
Time! Hey, quit bullshit now. I ain't got time for this now. Time!
We're going down to Chief Jenkins in Atlanta at this particular
I don't
point.
think you're giving us a fair shake.
We'll get back to you. Chief Jenkins, can you pull some of these strings together from your point of view and get some balance out of this discourse?
Well, I'd like to say at this point that I regret that more police chiefs did not appear on this program tonight because I don't think they've been well represented. Now, this program, I think, has emphasized that this nation has a very serious problem that we must find the answer to it. Now, the first order of business must always be law and order and justice for all. Now, the causes must be identified and they must be corrected. And that is exactly what we're determined to do here in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'd like for Reverend Williams to speak on that also.
Thank you very much, Chief. I've listened to the dialogue which has been going on here, and I know that the gentlemen in Newark have some problems, but I don't think we've been talking about what really concerns us. One of the things that I'd like us to get back on, and this is the question of white fear, and the fact that the police department in the city of Detroit is arming itself with the Stoner rifle, seems to me to lend support to the claim of the minorities in that city that they have something to fear. I certainly share the opinion of somebody who said this is not the sort of thing we want in a democratic society. Now, one of the things that we've got to understand is that white citizens do not have the same reason to complain as Negroes do against the police department.
Why is that so, Reverend?
This is so because policemen do make a difference in the treatment of Negro citizens and whites.
Why is that so?
That is so because they belong to a majority race of people who in this nation feel that there ought to be a difference made between Negroes and whites. Anybody in his sane mind knows that in America we have made differences between white and Negroes for a long time, and the majority of the whites still feel Negroes are inferior to whites and that they ought to be treated differently. Policemen are no different in this regard. I think the police department in Atlanta is working on the problem. We haven't cured it by any means. There are some policemen on our department here who haven't gotten the message yet that we're moving into a new era, and that they must themselves reorganize their attitude towards people. And when we talk about the hostility the police departments have, we've got to realize that I think most of these policemen feel they are representing the majority of the people in the community. I think in Atlanta, Georgia, when the police department knows that all of the citizens, including Negroes and whites, do not condone any of the skullduggery which they may engage in, it will stop. It'll happen in Detroit when white citizens support other citizens in that city. Seeing that policemen deal justly with all citizens, you will not have the same kind of problem. Now,
Reverend Williams,
yes.
time is running out on us. We're going to get back to you.
I think you'll agree. The sociologists, the economists, and other experts say that the masses of black people are dissatisfied, unemployed, oppressed, and fed up. So that he actually gets his support at the mass level. But now you have other Negroes at the class level who pretend not to go for him, because usually their job has been given to them by the white man. They have positions to which they have been appointed, and they think that the only way that they can protect their job is by pretending in front of the white man.
And these niggas say, why isn't David Chappelle saying anything? Because David Chappelle understands what the fuck he is seeing. And these streets will speak for themselves whether I'm alive or dead. I trust you guys. Let's enjoy your riots. They're not really even riots. Have you noticed that?
He was basically offering an excuse for the rioting and the looting that we're seeing. He's saying the streets are finally responding in the way that they need to respond. Well, let's just look at Black history to see if the streets responding and the streets being alive with rioting and looting in their own communities has ever served us. Where have we seen this before in Black America? Talk about the mid-1960s, the riots in Chicago, the riots in Detroit, where Black Americans upset about race issues, burned down their own neighborhoods and rioted. And what was the conclusion of that? Well, the conclusion, of course, was that naturally, the once flourishing cities, the automobile industries that were flourishing in Detroit and Chicago, they picked up, they packed up, and they left. And they depressed those neighborhoods. You want to know why Detroit looks the way that it does today? Why Chicago looks the way that it does today? Why Black Americans struggle in those inner city communities today? Well, it's because they chased out the business owners who said, there's no point for us to be here if this is how our businesses are going to be treated. They took the jobs with them. They took the economy with them. And what we see today is the consequence of that. So we're going to repeat all of that. And it's been endorsed by Dave Chappelle because the streets are alive. Black America is alive with anger, even if that anger, as we're seeing today, is not exactly justified.
It's so close to home. And we have to acknowledge our privilege and acknowledge the situation, which is we have agency. We have agency to lobby our government to change this and to stop these criminal acts.
Which the government itself has not made an effort or a step to take care of. So we all, I believe, are at each other's throats because the government has not laid down the laws of this land as far as the Constitution is concerned. We still put up with people like
Chris Hogan, who's a Black financial expert, he did a survey of 10,000 people, and what he found was that of those 10,000 people, 74% of millennials believed millionaires inherited their money, 52% of baby boomers did, but only 21% of millionaires received any inheritance at all. Just 16% inherited more than $100,000, only 3% received an inheritance
at or above $1 million. In reality, the best path toward wealth in this country is income mobility, not inherited wealth. This is factually untrue. The reality is,
why not just let the gangbangers kill one another? Is that what we want? Is that what we want to see? Blood splattered in the streets with no recourse?
And there came a time in the 60s when police officers became very frustrated with this. Day after day, we're out there. People are blocking highways, blocking the traffic to protest something or another. And people are picketing in front of an office building. Some company official is calling and screaming, "Get them out of here, lock them up." And you're in the middle. People had a right to protest, a right to free speech. There were rules. You couldn't lock them all up. But many of these powerful people had had their way until now, and as things began to change, the police were there to maintain order.
But when the answer to your problems come knocking on your door, are you ready to stop hanging on to your hang-ups?
Police power is always incredibly dangerous, and that a realistic media always watches and observes policemen and always tries to restrain policemen from unjust actions against citizens and any interference that's illegitimate with the ordinary person. Now, the ordinary person also is aware that policemen can abuse this authority. What was one of the shocking things of the 1960s, that we had this incredibly dumb generation of people that were shocked that policemen abuse authority.
I don't think that they would knowingly allow themselves to be used or misused against their own people. So if they are failing to do the job that our people expect of them, probably it's just through lack of understanding. But today their understanding is increasing, and you'll find that they're developing a better ability to work with all different factions for the betterment of our people. You have to set an example if you want others to do right and live a highly disciplined and a highly moral life of high morals. And by the parents displaying the highest of morals in front of the children at all times, automatically this sets a pattern or an example for the children. And in our schools, our children, the emphasis is placed upon the recognition of authority. And by the children recognizing authority and respecting authority, it's easy for anyone who is in authority to teach the child and discipline the child and make the child aware of the importance of living a life in accord with the law even after he grows up.
The Negro community has come forward to the police department, Detroit, and asked for more police protection.
All of its propaganda is directed at us to convince us that somehow or the other we must become white before they will accept us.
The problem is the divide and conquer tactics have always been used by the oppressor to keep the oppressed oppressed. And the NAACP has been used against the Muslims. Efforts have been made to use us against them, but the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says he'll work with the NAACP, the Urban League, and any other Negro organization that wants to uplift the black man as long as it doesn't conflict with our religious principles.
The problem is the standard for discussion is set by the whites, and a lot of Negroes now don't want to accept that standard anymore. They say we're going to have our own standard. I think that the hookup comes if you can develop a whole new standard where whites and Negroes can have a dialogue. Not either one of those are acceptable anymore. I mean, whites aren't going to accept Negro standards, and Negroes no longer want to be white. So that the clear thing is to develop a whole new standard, and then everybody move toward that so there can be some kind of dialogue.
I'm the vice president.
We are space traders bearing exquisite gifts that will restore your nation to its former glory. Nearly limitless quantities of gold and precious metals that will instantly erase your deficit. Machines that will renew your rivers and your air. Cold fusion technology for a safe, cheap, and inexhaustible source of energy. All we ask in return is the delivery to our vessels 5 days from now. Every child, woman, and man in your nation with at least 2,500 milligrams of melanin in their skin per square centimeter.
What the hell is melanin?
Most people say, if you don't like it here, get out. That's for spineless people. Spineless bastards who don't want to fight for what they believe in.
Well, I'm staying here because I was born here, and I am going to fight for my freedom. And before I have kids, I am going to make sure that this damn United States deserves the existence of my kids, because I will not rest until every Sunday school is safe for my kids, so that they won't get killed or beaten up like those kids down in Mississippi.
Now, there are many black veterans who are coming back, and they're mad, they're angry. Do you think that they're going to sit down through this? Our fathers didn't have the knowledge that we have. They sat through it. But there are other black youth that are not going to sit through it. We know about Che, we know about Fannin. We've read the books of our revolution. We've listened to Mao and his quotations. We know where we stand. We're not going to sit for it. We're asking, and if we ask and we don't get, we're prepared to stand up and take it. If I ask a man, I tell a man I am hungry. I tell him I am cold. And I ask him to do something about my condition. And this man holds a loaf of bread right in front of me so I can see it, and I keep asking him, I'm begging him to please give me a slice of the loaf of bread. I am hungry. Then it is known by every psychologist that the next step in the progression is I am going to knock him upside the head and take the bread from him. I'm not going to starve to death. All we're asking, no one wants to see blood. No one likes the smell of blood. No one wants war. Anyone who's been in war doesn't want war. Everyone knows what it is to see the inside of a man's gut hanging out and see your friends die, see relatives die. No one wants to regress back to the state of mind where you have to think it's all for the cause, therefore my mother has to die, my wife has to die, my brothers and sisters have to die. No one wants that. But you're pushing us to it. You're leaving us no choice. We're asking, we're begging. The students up at Columbia, they ask. The brothers down south ask. The brothers in Latin America, the brothers in Africa, they're all asking. All they're doing is asking. Our fathers asked. Our grandfathers asked. The presidents of our universities, our colleges had to go to your back doors to beg that their children be given just enough money so that they could be taught something to live off. And yet still they asked and asked and asked, and you refused to give them anything.
I asked him, what did the Negro community want?
He wants freedom, justice, and equality for the black people here in America, which you agree they don't have. If they did, you wouldn't have a race problem. And he says, if America cannot bring about freedom, justice, and equality for our people in this country, then America should allow us to leave. If we can't get along together, we should be allowed to depart and go someplace where we can set up housekeeping for ourselves. Then he says, if America doesn't want us to go back home among our own people, and at the same time they want to keep us here, since we can't stay here and get along together in peace, he says what America should do is separate part of the country and give us a section where we can live, and give us everything we need to get our particular section functioning independently, support us for 25 years until we are able to function independently in a society of our own, and in this way the problem will be solved.
The solution here isn't rocket science. Make corruption illegal. We already know Congress won't do it. I mean, one look at this chart will tell you that. What we need is a plan that lets us go around Congress and do what the American people do best. Fix this mess ourselves. Well, good news. We have that plan and it's already working. Now that we've got the problem covered, let us show you how to be part of the solution.
He said, there is no justice here for us black people. There is no future for us nor our children in civilized America. Doesn't that imply that you're going to get out, or that's his wish that you get out?
If he referred to those policemen out there as devils, who were heavily armed and knew that the Negroes whom they were shooting down in cold blood were not heavily armed, I don't think that those policemen themselves would deny that they're devils, nor would any Negro who witnessed such a deed deny that they are devils.
Well, about the other part of it, there's no justice here for us black people. There is no future for us nor our children in civilized America. And I didn't make that up. He said it in his own
And he's correct
publication.
in what he says, sir.
Oh, what does it mean? Does it mean you're going to get out, or
It
what?
means the same thing that Attorney General Robert Kennedy means when he says that the #1 domestic problem in America is the race problem. That it is almost impossible to solve it. It's almost impossible to give justice to Negroes.
I want to share part of my good fortune with you. He has no reason to.
I think there's going to be violence, see, because there already has been. I mean, when people try to free themselves, they kill Negroes in the South all the time. The Negro man has been emasculated and destroyed by the fact that every time he stood up, he got just snuffed out right there. So I don't think there's any question but that there's going to be violence and brutality. But my attitude is that the brutality and the violence shouldn't become the reason that you want to be free. But that's a very personal thing, the freedom is. See, the question isn't what is freedom to me, it's what price freedom. Because sometimes the price that you pay for freedom is the very thing that makes you a slave again. That's what I think happened in Russia in 1917. But I know that there's going to be violence. I mean, I think it gets blurred, especially the individual, if I face you violently. See, who knows where that violence began? See, I mean, I might, if I face you with a gun and I got orders to kill you and you got orders to kill me, then we can't really deal with each other. You're a target and I'm a target. So you can't really talk about that. But you can talk about the larger thing, the much more universal thing. The reason that you're there, see, is really not to kill, but to free.
God, do you believe that?
Definitely.
You do?
Definitely.
We're going to have to leave it at that. And Malcolm, I'm sure he's done a good job in rehabilitating you. It was a pleasure to have you on City Desk.
I'm in Chicago for the next 3 weeks at the local mosque at 54th and Greenwood for a special lecture series.
Let us take a look at Harlem, 1964, when approximately 20 Molotov cocktails were exploded in Harlem. And in 1965 in August in Watts, Los Angeles, 2,000 Molotov cocktails were exploded. I think that we are developing more sophistication, and I think in the next uprising, and I suspect it will probably come either in Washington, D.C. or in another unnamed city, where you're going to find 5,000 Molotov cocktails used.
Whoa! And they call me the Big Pill.
Well, if we'll all turn our books to the 29th Psalm.
Wait. Now,
That's
come on,
right,
stop playing with that
motherfucker.
thing, now.
You can't read. Oh, well. It's been lousy.
Wait. Now, listen, I've been thinking. I just wanted to come tell you I've been doing some thinking.
Could you be a man, T-Bone, for once?
Oh, come on, now. You're right. You know you're right. Change has definitely got to be made here.
Shut up! Now, you don't want to go out like a little bitch, do you? Big Daddy. Good thing you already peed. I don't think I can handle that.
Wait, now, come on, now. I changed. Like the blood thing. I know that's wrong, okay? I should get a job. Listen, just calm down. Let's go look at the paper, and then I'm gonna stop and look in tomorrow.
Tomorrow? Nigga, I hope you can handle a pitchfork.
Tang, listen to me. Violence never solved anything. If you shoot me, that's gonna make you just as bad as me.
T-Bone. That's the worst one yet.
Hey. Sometimes it takes a situation just like this to let a man like me know how wrong I've been. Right? Give me a chance. Let me get a job. Okay, then I can buy you that house. Remember the house? With the apple tree? I put up an apple tree, pear tree, pickle tree, grape tree. I'll put up any kind of tree you want now, okay? Just give me a chance, okay? This ain't the time to be doing nothing like this. You could have left after the first time I put my hands on you. You know why you didn't?
Ain't nothing out there.
Come on, now that's my shit you running. I told you that. To brainwash you, get up inside your head. Huh? Remember when we first met, we used to go to the park, tell me all about your childhood? So many people had already told you wasn't shit that you believed it. I just played on that, that's all. That's all. Okay?
All this. Coming from a man who sells his food stamps for half price so he can buy beer. See ya.
No, come on, not tag. Hey, look.
Move! What are they doing? Didn't that note say we were supposed to wait for instructions?
That ain't your little revolution. There ain't nothing out there but a bunch of niggas just like you that think that they ain't got nothing coming. Oh, shit!
See? Black folks can't do nothing right.
See? You brainwashed.
Now we reach the crux of the matter. The basic idea here is that any inequality can be chalked up to systemic racism. We are now ghost hunting. Notice, they've said nothing in this video. Nothing. The simple assumption is that if more black people percentage-wise, that must be due to systemic racism and not due to the number of crimes being committed by individuals who make a decision to commit a crime. When it comes to representation, the truth is there are many, many black Americans in Congress. We've had a black president of the United States. People choosing to run and people choosing to vote, that is an aspect of American freedom.
Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism.
Hell, I've been here all the time. And we've been Where were you? UK. Now, what do I have to say to you? The most advanced nation in the world. It has to be resolved. It has to be resolved because I want my children to have an answer. If not me, I personally prefer that I have an answer. I don't have, I like to think I don't have my lifetime to waste on this.
Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve.
But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left at 0% are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right at 100% are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law.
So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases.
We should always, as decent people, be re-examining our own biases and trying to wipe out bad thoughts we may be having about other people. But the idea that something as vague as you had a bad thought about a group is now responsible for the income inequality between black and white is sort of an absurd contention in the absence of any available evidence.
What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today.
It is certainly plausible that slavery and Jim Crow have affected how people's paths have gone in life and the circumstances of their birth. But the question is, how much? If we are going to change policy, and if we are going to effectuate change, shouldn't we be focused more on what are the bad policies today that specifically are keeping people down, and what behaviors can we change today to make our opportunities better, rather than focusing in on slavery or Jim Crow? The fact is that even if you buy into the entire narrative of systemic racism promoted by this video, it changes nothing.
The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. How does this happen? Well,
as a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources.
Or are you strung out on the tangy taste of cosmic slop?
The suggestion that simply pouring money into public schools is somehow going to be the solution has been belied by nearly every independent study ever done of public education. Obviously, we should be spending more on schools where not enough spending is going on, where there aren't school books or there aren't enough desks. But the real problem that's existing in educational performance has very little to do with income and a lot more to do with the access to educational opportunity provided in homes. If you have a single-family home, it is very difficult for mom to be able to help with homework. If you don't allow kids to go to better schools outside their neighborhood, rather than simply pouring money into...
Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
It's easy enough to say that we all have a role in making the system better, but when you suggest very few practical solutions other than rote democratic policies that have been failed nearly every time they've tried, it makes it difficult to believe this isn't just a political ploy, rather than an argument in favor of bettering individual human lives. To deny the effects of history would be idiotic. History obviously has consequences. And to deny that racism exists would be similarly idiotic. But to attribute every problem in American life to racism or inequity is to be foolish and counterproductive and not to make the world a better place.
And God, you tell us that this is too much to ask.
This is factually untrue.
You're sick. You're definitely sick. How can you tell me that it's too much to ask to be a human being?
Kill the white race. Get the man that represents the white power structure. Kill the white race.
White people ask me, why am I so angry? And, you know, I don't have any answer for him because it'd be ridiculous for me to answer him because he couldn't understand anyway, obviously, because he asked me the question.
The 400 years that I've existed.
What are you going to do with him?
Well, that does not concern you. We give you 5 days to decide, and the offer is non-negotiable. We will not try to coerce you in any way. Yet, I hope we can do some business together.
Well, I see the first aspect of this is to prevent the problem from becoming worse by dysgenics. This first word that
Would you
that
translate
I mentioned.
dysgenics for me and the audience?
What I
Would that be
is
sterilization?
No. Dysgenics, you see, means what that other chart I showed you says.
Should blacks,
that the least effective element.
Should blacks be sterilized?
No. I have a...
But if blacks are a problem and we do not allow...
This is inhumane. And
Dr.
I think one
Shackley
can
wants
find more
black
humane
people to
solutions to this.
Well, then how would... Then
I would propose something in which one of the key phrases, is regardless of sex, race, or welfare status. And this is
Look, the space traders seem perfectly nice and civil. Their planet might be one great big Club Med for all we know.
And this is the proposal. I call it a thinking exercise. It's mentioned in that pamphlet that I showed that you can obtain. And it goes this way, that you would offer a bonus to everyone to be sterilized. Now, we know we have a population explosion problem. We know that in India that bonuses in the form of transistor radios are offered to people.
Would this bonus be directed to black people specifically, more than whites?
Mr. Brown, what did I say just a moment ago? I said, regardless of sex, race, or welfare status.
Now, there is a group...
That's what I say.
There is a group of white people to whom this offer should be made also.
Absolutely.
Now,
the offer the offer is based upon the best estimates, best scientific estimates that one can have of any genetically carried disabilities. Now, there are some, I think, that any humane person would have no doubt about. And Dr. Welsing talked about dominant and recessive genes. I want to point out that sometimes a dominant gene can be a very bad thing, and it is a very bad thing for a neurological disease called Huntington's chorea, which is something like multiple sclerosis.
Which is more prominent in white people than black people.
That is correct. And I think that one should offer a large bonus for anyone who might be potentially carrying Huntington's chorea.
Dr. Shackley,
beyond this, it goes on with some other factors in this, but Dr. Welsing wishes to speak.
Are you aware that white people have more genetic diseases that affect their nervous system than people of color than black people?
I wouldn't be at all surprised. And I think blacks apparently have higher heart problems.
Would you suggest that all of these white people who are carrying these defective genes, you know, whose families may carry these defective genes, that they be examined and it would be suggested to them that they be sterilized? Would you suggest this?
Yes, I think I would, probably, in general.
I came to the unfortunate discovery that the only way to wrest the power you want is to wrest it, that you cannot persuade. You cannot...
I expect them to be thrilled, but how can I put this delicately? Their future electoral clout is going to be severely limited.
And Casper, let's be honest. Do you really think the aliens will treat them worse than we have?
Thank you.
Let me just say this. What is very interesting is in the study of biology, biologists who have studied evolution, one of the very interesting things that they say is that the more functional skin pigment cells in the animal kingdom, the higher you are on the scale of phylogenetic ascension. In other words, nature in the course of evolution went to its highest state when it produced a cell that could produce pigment, and that we were sliding backwards. The mutation to albinism is a step backwards in the scale of evolution. Are you aware of that, Dr. Shackley?
The decision has to be the will of the people and not the administration policy.
How about a national referendum? Have MCI fire up a couple of those yes and no 900 numbers.
Well, today is the day of reckoning for 20 million Americans of African descent. Voting will begin in just a few seconds from now. As you know, 2 telephone numbers will appear on your screen, one in favor and one against the Space Traders offer. After dialing the number of your choice, simply key in your personal security code. Here, ladies and gentlemen, are the 2 numbers. Polls will remain open for the next 3 hours, but we should be able to project a decision very shortly.
Yes.
And I would think it probably would have been negative.
No, it was not. It was positive.
Well,
the motor skills on the Giselle schedule indicated that earlier precocious walking children, there was a correlation between that and high intelligence.
This may be true. It might be true within a group. I'm not sure of that.
Well, maybe
I know that there is a correlation in terms of things earlier than walking. In this, at the 6-month stage, Nancy Bailey at Berkeley has established that white children who come from the most advanced families and who later, when they become older, are out at the top. At the first 6 months, they are relatively retarded compared to children who are from families of less accomplishment and who don't go as far. But this, so there are a number of these things certainly to be brought in.
Fine.
But this
Giselle schedule is a very authentic, accepted, institutional, psychological experiment.
And so is the Nancy Bailey early test.
I'd like to take another call at this point.
My people, oh, my people. The sit-ins and the boycotts of work.
Major motivation for racism in this country is the deeply held belief that black people should not have anything that white people don't. Not only do whites insist on better jobs, higher incomes, better neighborhoods, better schools, but they leap to gobble up our language, our dress, our music, and our dance. Therefore, I propose that from now...
That you cannot persuade. You cannot... it's a repudiation of the Mahatma Gandhi view But if you want to break the laws against miscegenation and racial separation, you've got to do sit-ins, break the law, you've got to storm the Bastille. If you want to, if you want to promote the cause of feminism, you've got to burn bras and capture the giant's attention somehow. I came to the conclusion that that those who hold power will hold it very closely and are never willing to share it.
Well, just follow the money. Right now, it's perfectly legal to buy political influence in America.
Don't count your chickens before they come home to roost.
Oh, somebody bring me some milk, because here come a big Oreo.
Yes, yes.
To anyone who believes that America is institutionally racist, I'll challenge you to do this. Go into communities and deal with problems by examining the roots of those problems, the foundations. The foundation of many problems starts with the individual, and there are factors.
Oh, sit down, Tom.
I am well aware of how I am perceived, but now is not the time for our petty squabbling.
America is a land of opportunity, as promised in our Declaration of Independence, and preserved legally in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We have amended our Constitution, and we have evolved as a nation. Our people stand proud to support and defend opportunity and freedom for all.
I cannot stand here any longer and be influenced by a man who has dedicated his entire life to sabotaging his own people.
Now, this came to me this morning. In order to ensure victory, we must stop resisting the offer. We circulate the rumor. White folks will go ape, wondering what we will encounter in this new land. They will gnash their teeth. They will even argue is an unconstitutional discrimination against whites.
Everybody, thank you. My name's Casey Kasem, and welcome to Alien Trade Referendum. Just say no! Can you imagine life without jazz? No! Or without the blues? No! Or without rock and roll? No! Well, that's what life would have been like in these United States without the contributions of African Americans. If this referendum passes and we vote to send dark-skinned people up into outer space, I'll tell you one thing, you can forget about ever seeing another dream team again.
You know, we didn't bring in any scientists or anything. People yourself, just entertainers. Yeah. Okay.
This is for people.
This is for people.
Eggheads.
So tomorrow, when you pick up your phone to vote in the privacy of your own home, just think.
Privacy of your own home.
Chocolate,
gun in this house.
But we got her!
Shut up! You know I'm a parole bitch. Get dog. Go down to the river and just take this gun. We'll dump it in there. That's gonna be ended. What you gonna do? You gonna forget all about this. I mean, about this. Don't mention it to nobody. Don't even mention it to me. Get back down.
Brought him to the show. Black man does the dishes. You down the fine. Gave him trouble to cheat. Kept on towing the line. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. Before this movement fails, we all go down in jail. Everybody's got a right to live. Black man dug the pipeline, both night and day. Black man did the work, while white man got the faith. Now look at here, son, thinking about his income that I never had. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we all go down in jail. Everybody's got a right to live. Black man picked the cotton long time ago. He's been the victim since brought him to the show. Black man dug the ditches, hewed down the pines, gave his trouble to Jesus, kept on towing the line. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this movement fails, we all go down in jail. Everybody's got a right to live. Black man dug the pipelines, both night and day. Black man did the work, while the white man got the faith. Now look at here, son, this is a brand new day. No more full-time work, no more part-time pay. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this movement fails, we all go down in jail. Everybody's got a right to live. Yeah. I want my share of silver. I want my share of gold. Want my share of justice. Kill my dying soul. Black men dug the ditches long time ago. He's been the victim since brought him to this show. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this movement fails, we all go down in jail. Everybody's got a right to live.
Debate. You gave the argument that because capitalism in practice requires expropriation and robbery, that there are so few developed capitalist states, and gave the example of the alleged British expropriation of India. This leads me to wonder from what part of India did the British expropriate the steam engine and the many intellectual developments which sparked the Industrial Revolution in that country. If material goods were the fundamental prime cause of the Industrial Revolution, why didn't the Indians have their own Industrial Revolution centuries before the British came along? In summary, I ask, didn't the Industrial Revolution require reason and intellect as its prime cause rather than expropriation?
Would that the question was as clever as it sounds. Have you, sir, or has anyone else here, read Edmund Burke's speech on the impeachment of Warren Hastings? In there you will find laid out in some detail the description of the enormous transfer of wealth from India to the islands in the North Sea, known as Great Britain and Northern Ireland today. Burke was in fact so alarmed by this process, it wasn't out of compassion for India that he mentioned it. He was alarmed that the process was in fact enriching a whole new class that would corrupt Parliament in Britain, and not without reason, and that's why Hastings had to be impeached. That is how some of the capital that led to the Industrial Revolution was accumulated. That's what I said. Now, it's also true that India got the steam engine as a result, probably rather earlier than it would have otherwise, which is why Marx said, as I said, that the British were probably justified in putting down the Indian Mutiny of 1857, because that mutiny was not a struggle for independence, it was an attempt to restore the Mughal imperial authorities, who were a relatively less advanced mode of production. Now, is that clear? If I didn't make it clear before, let me take the opportunity to make it clear now. That is the compliment Marxism pays to the origins of capitalism. I haven't yet, though, had an answer to my question about why capitalism did not emerge in such very large and theoretically prosperous and productive areas of the globe. And I do think that it is a question that deserves an answer from the capitalist side.
Colonialism is the best thing that ever happened to the colonies. We view the colonialization of India and the rest of the world by England primarily, and then later by other countries, including ourselves, as the extending of wealth and civilization to backward regions. All the interactions, in essence, I mean, I can't say that, you know, every single one of them, but the essence, the thrust of those interactions was free trade, voluntary employment for people who were otherwise starved. As one other aside concrete from this, the Arabs have no right to that oil. The same principle. Oil under the feet of people who don't know what property is, who don't have a civilized society, who are nomads or dictatorships, is not the property of their little king. It is the property of anybody who comes in and produces it. And it was the American and Western oil companies that produced that oil. They even went and made contracts with those little petty dictators, even though, you know, they morally had no claim to that oil. And the same principle goes to any other natural resources. Natural resources belong to those people who make use of them. And there was the civilized countries that took things that were just junk and garbage to the rest of the world and paid them for them. The transfer of wealth was both ways and much more to the benefit of the backward people, as sheer common sense would tell you, than it was to England. India needed England 1,000 times more than the other way around. Now, the challenge, which I hadn't heard before, was why didn't capitalism develop in large areas of the world like India where it didn't develop? Because we believe that capitalism does not develop out of historical necessity, but out of people's ideas. Capitalism reached its apex in the United States in 1776 because the ideas of the people were those of John Locke. Every one of the founding fathers read John Locke, they read Aristotle, they read Cicero. This is known fact. The language of John Locke's second treatise of government is in the Independence, the Declaration of Independence. The political philosophy of England at that time was what caused capitalism to exist here. Now, needless to say, the opposite political philosophy is in place in areas like India. They are mystics. They don't believe in reason, they don't believe in nature, they don't believe in natural rights. So the answer is, where there is a pro-capitalist philosophy, their capitalism will flourish. Where there isn't, it won't.
And so as we say goodbye to our dark friends and neighbors, we say hello to a new era of American peace and prosperity. For World News Now, I'm Stryker O'Rourke.
Fucking A, Black Lives Matter. I'm in. I'm with you, brothers. Yeah, I mean, that felt racist as it came.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we are...
In their own way, they have been doing their best to bring about freedom, justice, and equality and human dignity for the black people in this country.
Long time ago, he's been the victim since brought him to the show. Black man dug the ditches, hewed down the pines, gave his trouble to Jesus.